My name is Captain Ethan Miller, United States Army. That night, the air inside the Beacon Grand shimmered with light and ceremony. Every chandelier reflected a lifetime of service, and the room was filled with medals, polished shoes, and names that carried weight. The gala was meant to celebrate honor, but for me, it felt like a test I hadn't been invited to take. I stood tall in my uniform, every ribbon perfectly aligned, every button gleaming, pretending I didn't notice how my family's table went silent when I entered. The orchestra played something elegant, the kind of music meant to keep people from noticing tension. My adoptive father, General Raymond Miller, sat at the head of the table, his jaw tight. My mother, Evelyn, smiled for the crowd, the kind of smile that looked like it hurt. The two sons beside them leaned in, whispering as if they shared a joke. I walked toward them, metal still warm from the ceremony, pride clashing with something colder. Evelyn's glass slipped from her hand, shattering against the marble floor. A sharp gasp swept through the room, and for a moment, all eyes were on her. Raymond leaned forward, his voice low, smooth as glass cutting through my chest. "You don't belong here, Captain. Not at this table." His words didn't echo, but they landed like a punch. I froze, hands steady at my sides, the room spinning in quiet chaos as the waiter rushed in with a towel. My brothers turned away. Evelyn dabbed her gown with trembling fingers, acting as if nothing had happened. The laughter and music resumed, but everything felt too loud. I took one step back, then another, until the crowd swallowed me whole. It wasn't anger I felt, not yet. It was the heavy stillness of knowing that the people who raised me would rather pretend I wasn't one of them. Across the ballroom, near the stage, I saw him. General Thomas Miller. My grandfather. His uniform was dark, his shoulders slightly bowed with age, but his eyes were fixed on me. There was something in that stare, something final. That was the night my family turned their backs on me, and the night General Thomas Miller decided to reveal everything. I grew up in a house that looked more like a museum than a home. Every wall carried medals, framed photographs, and portraits of men in uniform, all with the same steel gray eyes and the same carved expressions. The Miller family had been soldiers for 4 generations, and everything inside that house reminded me of it. I was the quiet one in the corner, the adopted name that never quite fit the frame. The hallways smelled like leather and polished wood. Dinner was served at exactly 7, no matter what. My father, General Raymond Miller, sat at the head of the table and spoke like he was still commanding troops. His words were clipped, efficient, meant to instruct, not to comfort. My mother, Evelyn, floated through each meal like a ghost of good manners, making sure her smile stayed fixed even when no one was looking. I never saw them touch, not even once. The conversations were about numbers, promotions, and people I didn't know. Sometimes I tried to speak, to tell them about school, but Raymond's silence would fall like a wall, and my words would die before reaching him. I learned to eat quietly, to make myself smaller. When I was 12, I realized there was no photograph of me on the wall. I searched twice, just to be sure, tracing my fingers along the rows of faces and medals. The walls carried everyone's story but mine. Evelyn once told me it was better that way, that my place in the family didn't need to be seen to be real. I wanted to believe her, but the truth was colder than her voice. Even the air in that house felt like it belonged to someone else. Raymond never raised his hand to me, but his silence was sharper than punishment. He spoke through disappointment, through the way his eyes flicked past me like I wasn't worth the trouble of focus. I used to listen to the grandfather clock ticking in the hall, counting the seconds until I could step outside. Outside, I could breathe, even if I didn't know where I belonged. The house taught me discipline, control, and how to hide everything that hurt. It also taught me that belonging is not given, it's earned. And that lesson, whether they meant it or not, became the only thing I carried with me when I left. General Thomas Miller never treated me like a child who needed protection. From the first day he took me to his property outside Arlington, he treated me like a soldier in training. The field behind his house became our ground for lessons that had nothing to do with textbooks. He handed me a compass, a canteen, and a pack heavier than I could carry, then told me to move until I stopped thinking about how tired I was. When I fell, he never reached down to pull me up. He only said that a soldier's worth isn't in blood, but in how he stands when he's broken. I didn't understand it then, but I carried that sentence with me like a second heartbeat. The general was strict, but there was something honest about his silence. He never looked at me with pity, only expectation. It was the first time I felt seen for what I could become, not for where I came from. After training, we would sit on his porch, boots muddy, clothes drenched in sweat. He would pour 2 glasses of water, one for him, one for me, and talk about the things he'd learned too late. He said that discipline without compassion built soldiers, but not men. I listened to every word. Raymond never joined those afternoons. He said he didn't see the point in playing soldier with a boy who didn't belong to him. The distance between them stretched wider each year, and somehow, I became the line drawn between father and son. The general didn't talk about feelings, but he showed me trust in small ways. When I turned 17, he placed an old service pin in my hand. It had been his from Vietnam, scratched and faded. He told me it wasn't a gift, it was a test. Earn it, he said. Make the name mean something again. That was the day I decided to apply to West Point. I studied until my eyes burned, trained until my hands bled. I wanted to prove that I was more than a name tucked at the bottom of a family tree. When I received my acceptance letter, the first person I told wasn't Raymond or Evelyn, it was the general. He didn't smile, but his eyes softened, and for the first time, I felt like I belonged somewhere. When I first wore the uniform, it felt heavier than the pack the general once made me carry. Not because of the fabric or the medals I hoped to earn, but because every eye in the room seemed to question if I deserved to be there. I was the grandson of General Thomas Miller, a name that opened doors I never asked to walk through. The whispers followed me through every assignment, every exercise. I learned early that silence was safer than defense. I woke before the others, stayed after lights out, ran drills until my body refused to move. When others rested, I cleaned my rifle twice. It wasn't about perfection, it was about survival. My performance was a shield against the doubts I could feel behind every salute. The first year was the hardest. I received no calls from home, no congratulations, only the steady hum of distance. I wrote to Raymond every month with the same tone of respect I would use with a commanding officer. I told him about training, about the lessons I remembered from the general. I never asked for praise. I only wanted acknowledgement. The letters went unanswered. I used to imagine him reading them, folding them neatly, and throwing them away. That thought hurt less than believing he never opened them. During inspection one morning, a senior officer said that soldiers like me had an easier path. The name Miller did the marching for us, he joked. I smiled, saluted, and went back to work, but something cracked inside. I promised myself I would earn my name the hard way, even if it killed me. Nights on base were the loneliest. The others shared stories about families, about girls waiting back home, about fathers proud of them. I had none of that. The only father figure I had was the one who had stopped calling me son. I carried that silence with me through every deployment. I learned to turn pain into precision. Orders became my language, discipline my way of speaking without needing to explain who I was. The more I achieved, the quieter Raymond became. Later, I heard from another officer that he never mentioned me, not once. To him, I was a reminder of something he couldn't erase. I didn't know what that meant yet, but I felt it every time I saw his name in reports and realized we were serving the same flag, but on different sides of pride. I wasn't fighting for approval anymore. I was fighting to exist. Syria was the kind of place where the horizon never stopped burning. The mission was supposed to be a routine evacuation, but routine never existed there. When the first explosion hit, dust swallowed the convoy, and radio contact vanished. I remember the screams, the ringing in my ears, the sound of children crying somewhere behind the smoke. Orders told me to retreat, but something stronger kept me moving forward. I crawled through debris, dragging 2 civilians to cover, then went back for a third. By the time the blast hit again, I was already on top of him, shielding his body with mine. The world went white, then silent. When I woke up, I was in a military hospital in Germany. The walls were clean, the sheets stiff, and my chest felt like it was on fire. My name was on every screen back home. They called it heroism. I called it survival. For days, reporters tried to reach me, but I stayed silent. I didn't want medals. I wanted to know if the civilians had lived. When General Thomas walked into my hospital room, he looked older than I remembered. His uniform was neat, but his hands trembled when he reached for mine. He didn't say he was proud. He just told me that bravery meant doing what was right even when no one was watching. His voice cracked when he said it, and for a second, I saw not the general but the man who had raised me. When he left, I stared at the medal on my nightstand and wondered what he wasn't telling me. Weeks later, I returned home to whispers in the press. They said I was being considered for the Veterans Honor Foundation, the very organization my family had built and Raymond controlled. At first, I thought it was only talk, but the more I heard it, the more I saw the change in his tone during briefings. Raymond stopped looking at me like a soldier. He looked at me like a threat. That was the beginning of the storm I didn't see coming. The ballroom shimmered with brass and crystal. Every uniform was pressed, every medal perfectly aligned under the golden light. It was supposed to be a night of pride, a celebration of service. My name was called among the honorees, and the applause was polite but distant. As I walked toward the family table, I saw Raymond's jaw tighten, Evelyn's eyes fixed on her wine glass, and my siblings' practiced smiles falter. The air between us felt colder than the marble floor. I reached the table just as a waiter passed with a tray of champagne. Evelyn's hand shook, and the glass slipped from her grip, shattering into a sharp echo that silenced the nearby chatter. Every head turned. For a second, I thought she might apologize. Instead, she looked at me like I had caused it. Raymond leaned in close, his voice quiet enough for only me to hear. "You don't belong here, Captain. Not at this table." He didn't look up again. Evelyn turned away. The rest of the family followed her lead, standing slightly, as if adjusting their seats. But really, it was a dismissal. A room full of generals and soldiers watched as I stepped back. The silence was worse than any explosion I'd heard in the field. I forced a smile, nodded politely, and returned to the table reserved for staff officers. No one spoke to me. The sound of cutlery and forced laughter filled the air again, as if nothing had happened. But from across the room, I could feel another gaze on me. General Thomas Miller sat at the head table, his posture straight but his eyes shadowed. He had aged since the hospital visit. His skin looked pale under the light, his hand trembling slightly as he lifted his glass. He wasn't supposed to be drinking. The doctors had warned him after the diagnosis. I could see the pain behind his calm. The disease had taken his strength, but not his pride. He looked at Raymond, then at me, and in that moment, something inside him seemed to harden. The speeches continued. Raymond spoke next, a flawless performance about sacrifice, honor, and family legacy. The crowd applauded, but the words felt hollow, rehearsed, and self-serving. I looked down at my glass, pretending to sip, pretending not to care. When the applause faded, the general pushed himself up from his chair. It was slow, deliberate. A few tried to stop him, but he brushed them off. He leaned on his cane, his voice low but steady. "Tonight, I will speak as a soldier, not as a grandfather." The crowd stilled. Raymond froze, his confident smile slipping. Evelyn's face drained of color. The general's eyes met mine across the room. He raised his hand, asking for the microphone. Raymond whispered something to the host, shaking his head, but the host hesitated, torn between protocol and the authority of the man who had once commanded armies. The general's voice cut through the hesitation. "Give me the microphone." The words were quiet but absolute. No one in the room dared move until the host obeyed. As he took the microphone, the hall seemed to shrink around him. He looked at the audience, then at our family, and I knew before he spoke that nothing about our name would ever be the same again. The room went completely still when General Thomas spoke into the microphone. His voice carried the weight of command, but there was something raw beneath it, something human. For 50 years, he said, the Miller family had stood as a symbol of honor, integrity, and sacrifice. Yet tonight, he continued, that legacy would mean nothing if it was built on silence and shame. The audience shifted uneasily, sensing the tremor in his words. Raymond half rose from his chair, his face tight, whispering for him to stop, but the general held up a trembling hand. His eyes, though dimmed by age and illness, still commanded the room. He said there was a truth he had hidden, a mistake that had haunted him every day of his life. He looked directly at me as he said it. Years ago, during a time when he was still building the foundation and traveling for military campaigns, he had fallen in love with a woman who worked under him. It wasn't an affair born of lust, but of loneliness, of finding comfort in someone who saw the man behind the medals. When she became pregnant, fear took over. He feared scandal. He feared destroying his family's name. So he paid her to disappear and promised himself he'd make it right later. The woman left, and the child was left behind. He paused, his breathing shallow. That child, he said quietly, was me. A stunned silence swept through the hall. Evelyn gasped, covering her mouth. Raymond's face turned red, his fists clenched on the table. The guests exchanged glances, whispers rising like a tide. The general continued, each word slower than the last. He explained how guilt drove him to bring me into the family under the lie of adoption. He made Raymond and Evelyn raise me as their own, believing it would give me a place without exposing the truth. But instead of love, I became a reminder of his sin. He admitted that he had failed me, failed everyone, by letting his pride rule over his conscience. His voice cracked when he said he couldn't die with that lie still standing between us. Raymond stood, shouting that it was madness, that his father was confused, but no one moved to support him. The general faced him with a calm that cut deeper than anger. You were my pride, Raymond, but you lost sight of what honor truly meant. You turned duty into vanity. Evelyn broke down, tears streaking her makeup. She whispered that she had only done what she was told, that she was protecting the family. The general shook his head. Protecting the family should never have meant destroying its heart. Then he turned back to the audience and spoke of the Veterans Honor Foundation. He said it was not a reward to be inherited, but a trust to be earned. He said that after watching me all these years, especially during my service in Syria, he saw in me the values that the foundation was supposed to represent. Not blood, not legacy, but integrity. That was why he had decided to pass leadership to me. The room erupted in gasps. Raymond shouted that it was betrayal, that his father had lost his mind. The general didn't look at him. He just said he was tired of building legacies on lies. His final words echoed through the hall like a verdict. Tonight, I set things right. The microphone trembled in his hand. He looked at me then, his eyes soft with something between apology and pride. I wanted to speak, but the words wouldn't come. All I could do was stand and salute him. It wasn't about rank or blood. It was a soldier's way of accepting a new, profound command. The command to lead with honor, not just bloodline. The general nodded once, tears glinting under the lights. Raymond sank back into his seat, defeated and furious, while Evelyn wept quietly. The guests sat frozen, unsure whether to clap, to leave, or to pretend it hadn't happened. The general handed the microphone to the host, whispered something I couldn't hear, and walked out slowly, cane tapping against the marble floor. I followed him with my eyes until he disappeared through the doors. That was the night everything I thought I knew about my family collapsed. And yet for the first time in my life, I felt free. The funeral was quiet, almost too dignified for the man who had once filled every room with his presence. Flags lined the cemetery road, their colors muted by the gray morning sky. Soldiers stood in formation, rifles lowered in respect, while a bugle carried the final note of farewell. I stood beside the casket, feeling the weight of silence press against my chest. The general's uniform lay folded inside, medals gleaming one last time under the soft light. When the flag was handed to me, I felt both honored and broken. He had been my mentor, my father, and my greatest lesson in failure and redemption. Days later, a letter arrived in handwriting I hadn't seen in years. Evelyn's. Her words were uneven, the ink smudged as if written through tears. She said she had spent her life protecting an illusion, one built on fear and pride. She said she wished she had treated me as more than a symbol of her shame. At the end, she wrote that forgiveness doesn't erase the past, but it gives it a place to rest. I folded the letter and kept it inside my jacket. A week later, I visited the grave alone. The sky was clear that day, the kind of blue the general would have called parade weather. I placed the medal I had received for Syria on his headstone. It caught the sunlight, flashing like a heartbeat. I told him that I finally understood what he meant when he said that honor without compassion was just pride in disguise. The wind moved through the trees, soft and steady, almost like an answer. I didn't cry. I just stood there, letting the silence settle around me until it felt like peace. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't surrender. It was the only way to carry a name without letting it crush you. I whispered that blood doesn't make a soldier. Forgiveness does. Then I turned and walked away, leaving the medal to shine in the sun, the final salute between a father and a son who had finally made peace.